They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But nobody tells you that sometimes revenge serves itself. My name is Evelyn Greger. I'm 34 years old, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. And this is the story of how the man who destroyed me became the architect of his own downfall. But before I continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It helps me know I'm not alone in this, that my story reaches people who understand what it means to rise from the ashes. 7 years ago, I stood in the bathroom of the apartment I shared with Garrett Holbrook, staring at 2 pink lines that would change everything. My hands trembled as I held that test, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of knowing that nothing would ever be the same. I was 27, working as a junior architect at a prestigious firm in downtown Salt Lake City, and I thought I had my entire life mapped out like one of the blueprints that covered my desk. Garrett and I had been together for 4 years. 4 years of Sunday morning pancakes, of hiking the Wasatch Mountains every weekend, of building what I believed was an unshakable foundation. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, made good money, drove a Benz he was far too proud of, and talked constantly about our future. The house we'd buy in Draper. The trips to Europe we'd take. The family we'd build. That positive pregnancy test should have been the beginning of our greatest adventure. Instead, it became the day I learned who Garrett Holbrook really was. When I told him that evening, his face did something I'd never seen before. It went completely blank, like someone had wiped away every emotion and left nothing but a mannequin sitting across from me. We were at our favorite Italian restaurant, the one where he told me he loved me for the first time. I thought the setting would make the moment special. He set down his fork with precision that felt mechanical. Then he said 6 words that carved themselves into my soul. I'm not ready to be trapped. Trapped. That's what I was to him. That's what our child was. A trap. I tried to reason with him that night, tried to remind him of every conversation we'd had about wanting children someday. But Garrett had a response that shattered me completely. He claimed he'd never wanted children, that I'd misunderstood, that I was trying to manipulate him into a life he never agreed to. He actually used the word manipulate, his voice rising in the restaurant until other diners turned to stare. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. Not just emotionally distant, but physically absent. He moved out of our apartment, blocked my number, and when I tried to reach him through mutual friends, he told everyone I was unstable, that I'd gotten pregnant on purpose to force him into marriage, that he had proof I'd tampered with birth control. The cruelty of that lie took my breath away. Our friends, the people I'd laughed with at barbecues and game nights, began looking at me differently. Some stopped returning my calls altogether. Garrett had poisoned every well. I was alone, pregnant, and suddenly fighting to maintain my reputation in a social circle that had decided I was a villain. The pregnancy was difficult. I developed preeclampsia in my 3rd trimester and had to go on bed rest, which meant leaving my job earlier than planned. My savings dwindled rapidly. My mother flew out from Nevada to help, but she had her own health issues and couldn't stay long. I spent most of those months alone in a 1-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, feeling my daughter kick inside me while scrolling through social media photos of Garrett living his best life. He'd started dating someone new just 6 weeks after leaving me. Her name was Lydia Chen, and she was everything I wasn't at that moment. Carefree, childless, available for spontaneous weekend trips to Park City. The photos of them together felt like tiny knives. Him smiling in ways he'd stopped smiling with me months before I'd gotten pregnant. Her head on his shoulder. The 2 of them at concerts, at rooftop bars, at the very restaurant where he'd called me a trap. When I gave birth to Isla Grace Greger on a snowy February morning, I texted Garrett one last time from my hospital bed. I sent him a photo of her tiny face, her eyes squeezed shut, her impossibly small fingers curled into fists. I wrote, "Your daughter was born today. She's healthy. She has your nose. If you ever want to know her, the door is open." He never responded. That silence was somehow worse than all the cruel words he'd thrown at me. It was absolute. Final. It told me that to Garrett Holbrook, Isla didn't exist. We were ghosts in a life he'd successfully exorcised. So, I did what any mother would do. I built a new life. The first year was brutal. I lived on credit cards and my mother's modest checks. I worked freelance architecture jobs from home while Isla napped, designing residential additions and small commercial projects for clients who didn't care that I was working in pajamas covered in spit up. Every milestone felt bittersweet. Her first smile, her first tooth, her first word, which was mama, and which made me sob because there would never be a dada to follow. But something happened in that darkness. I got angry. Not the hot, destructive kind of anger, but the cold, focused kind that builds empires. I started putting every ounce of my pain into my work. I entered my designs in competitions. I networked relentlessly, making connections at online conferences while Isla played at my feet. I published articles about sustainable architecture in trade journals. I made myself visible. By Isla's second birthday, I'd built enough of a portfolio to start my own firm. Gregor Architecture was born in a corner of my living room with a laptop and a dream fueled by spite. I wanted Garrett to see my name somewhere, someday, and choke on his regret. The universe had other plans. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd submitted a design for a mixed-use development in downtown Salt Lake City, a project that would revitalize an entire block near the Gateway. It was ambitious, sustainable, and incorporated elements of Utah's natural landscape in ways that honored the state's beauty. I didn't expect to win. Dozens of firms had submitted proposals, many with far more resources than my one-woman operation. But I did win. And the client turned out to be someone who would change everything. His name was Frederick Callahan, and he was a developer with deep pockets and deeper connections. He was 63, silver-haired, and had built half of the notable commercial properties in the Salt Lake Valley. He was also Garrett Holbrook's boss. I didn't know this when I signed the contract. I didn't know it during our first 3 meetings, where Frederick praised my vision and my innovative approach to sustainable design. I learned it during a project dinner when Frederick mentioned his top sales director would be joining us to discuss the retail component of the development. Garrett walked into that restaurant, saw me sitting across from his boss, and I watched the color drain from his face like water from a broken glass. The evening was exquisite torture. Frederick had no idea about our history, and I wasn't about to enlighten him. Garrett had to sit there, professional smile plastered on his face, while his boss lavished praise on the woman he'd abandoned. While Frederick talked about giving me additional projects, while he mentioned casually that this development could be the launch of something big for Gregor Architecture. Garrett's eyes kept darting to me, searching for something. Anger maybe, or vindication. But I gave him nothing. I was pleasant, professional, and utterly indifferent. That indifference, I later realized, scared him more than rage ever could. The development was a massive success. It won awards. It was featured in Architectural Digest. It put Gregor Architecture on the map and brought in clients from across the western United States. Within 3 years, I had 15 employees and an office in a renovated warehouse with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. I bought a house in the Avenues, one of those beautiful historic homes with a wraparound porch and a yard where Isla could play. I hired a nanny, who became like family. I started dating again, casually, never letting anyone too close but proving to myself that I was more than my abandonment. And Garrett watched all of this from whatever distance he maintained. I know he watched because mutual acquaintances would occasionally mention that he'd asked about me. About Isla. About whether I ever talked about him. I never did. Then, 2 months ago, he showed up at my office. My assistant buzzed me. "There's a Garrett Holbrook here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's personal." My heart did something complicated. It raced and stopped simultaneously. I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 years, not since that dinner with Frederick. I'd built walls so high I'd convinced myself they were impenetrable. "Send him in," I heard myself say. He looked older. The cocky confidence had been replaced by something that looked like desperation wrapped in an expensive suit. His hairline had receded slightly. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. "Thank you for seeing me." I didn't invite him to sit. I stood behind my desk, this beautiful custom piece made from reclaimed wood, in my office that screamed success, and I waited. "I know I have no right to be here," he began. "I know what I did was unforgivable. But I've been thinking about you and about our daughter, Isla, and I was wondering if maybe we could talk about me having a relationship with her." Our daughter. After 7 years of silence, she was suddenly our daughter. Why now? I kept my voice level, professional, like he was a client pitching a project I had no interest in funding. He sat down without permission, and I watched him crumble into the chair. "Lydia and I broke up. And I've been in therapy, dealing with my fear of commitment, my selfishness. My therapist helped me see that I abandoned my own child, and that's something I need to make right. For Isla's sake. Every child deserves to know their father." The audacity of it stole my breath. He'd packaged his redemption arc in therapeutic language, as if acknowledging his monstrosity somehow erased it. "You signed away your parental rights," I said quietly. 2 years after Isla was born, you signed legal documents terminating your rights so you wouldn't have to pay child support. You remember that, Garrett? You had a lawyer send me papers saying you contested paternity and wanted nothing to do with her. I was different then. I was scared and stupid, and I made the worst mistake of my life. His eyes were actually welling up. "I'm begging you, Evelyn. Let me meet her. Let me try to be a father. I have so much to offer her now." And that's when I understood. This wasn't about Isla at all. This was about Garrett's guilt, his midlife crisis, his need to feel like a good person. He wanted absolution, and he expected me to provide it by handing over the daughter he denied. "Get out of my office," I said. "Evelyn, please. Get out, or I'll call security." He left, but he didn't give up. Over the next weeks, he sent letters to my house. He tried to contact my mother. He sent gifts for Isla, toys and books and clothes she didn't need, that I returned unopened. He reached out to my business partner, tried to use professional connections to get to me. And then he made his fatal mistake. He filed a petition with the court seeking to establish paternity and gain visitation rights. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. After everything, after the abandonment and the legal termination and years of silence, he thought he could simply lawyer his way back into our lives. That's when I stopped playing defense and went on the attack. I hired the best family attorney in Utah, a woman named Patricia Whitmore, who had a reputation for destroying deadbeat parents in court. We built a case that documented every cruelty, every abandonment, every lie Garrett had told. We had the texts where he'd called me manipulative, the legal documents where he'd contested paternity, testimonies from friends about his smear campaign, medical records showing my preeclampsia and the stress-induced complications I'd suffered. But the piece of resistance, the thing that would obliterate him completely, came from an unexpected source. Remember Lydia Chen, the woman he'd started dating right after leaving me? Turns out, Garrett had a pattern. Patricia found her through private investigators. Lydia had also gotten pregnant during their relationship about 3 years ago. And Garrett had done to her exactly what he'd done to me. The same words, the same accusations, the same abandonment. Lydia had miscarried at 12 weeks, partially due to the stress of Garrett's rejection, and she'd been carrying rage about it ever since. She was willing to testify. The court date approached, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 7 years. Genuine peace. Not because I was vindictive, but because I was protecting my daughter from a man who only wanted her as a prop in his redemption story. 2 days before we were scheduled to appear in court, Garrett called me. Not texted, called. I let it go to voicemail, and what he said there gave me the final piece of understanding I needed. "Evelyn, please, I'm begging you to settle this. My reputation is going to be destroyed. Frederick found out about the court case, about Lydia, about all of it. I might lose my job. My fiancé is threatening to leave me. Please, I made mistakes, but I don't deserve to have my entire life ruined over this. Can't we work something out? For Isla's sake." For Isla's sake. Even now, he was using her as a shield. I didn't call him back. I showed up to court instead. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Patricia presented our case with surgical precision. She showed the pattern of abandonment. She brought Lydia to the stand, and watching Garrett's face as his ex-girlfriend detailed his cruelty was almost worth the 7 years of pain. She presented expert testimony about the psychological harm that could come to a child from allowing an unstable, unreliable father into her life. Garrett's attorney tried to paint him as a reformed man, someone who'd made mistakes but deserved a second chance at fatherhood. But every argument crumbled under the weight of evidence. You can't reform your way out of abandoning 2 pregnant women. You can't therapy speak your way past legal documents terminating your parental rights. The judge, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray eyes, listened to everything. Then she looked at Garrett with something like disgust. "Mr. Holbrook," she said, "fatherhood is not a hobby you pick up when it becomes convenient. It's not a redemption arc you write for yourself when your conscience becomes uncomfortable. This court finds that you voluntarily and repeatedly abandoned your biological child, that you took legal action to sever your parental rights, and that your current petition is not motivated by the child's best interests, but by your own emotional needs. Your petition for paternity establishment and visitation is denied. Furthermore, this court is issuing a protective order preventing you from contacting Ms. Greger or her daughter for the next 5 years unless the child, upon reaching maturity, chooses to seek you out. This hearing is adjourned." I walked out of that courtroom with my head high. Patricia hugged me in the hallway, and I let myself cry for the first time since this nightmare began. Not tears of sadness, but of release. That evening, I went home to Isla. She was 6 years old, beautiful and brilliant, with Garrett's nose but my eyes and my determination. She was building a complex structure with blocks, narrating to herself about load-bearing walls and architectural integrity. My child, who'd absorbed my passion through osmosis. "Mama," she called when I walked in. "Come see what I built." I sat down next to her and admired her creation, this impossible tower that defied gravity through the logic only a 6-year-old could understand. And I realized something profound. The revenge I'd spent years fantasizing about, the public destruction I'd imagined for Garrett, had happened. But not because I'd orchestrated it. He'd destroyed himself. His pattern of cruelty had caught up with him. His inability to take responsibility had cost him his job, his relationship, his reputation, and any chance of knowing his daughter. I didn't need to be the instrument of his downfall. His own character had been sufficient. But here's the twist nobody saw coming, the part that still keeps me awake some nights. 3 weeks after the court decision, I received a letter. Not from Garrett, but from Frederick Callahan, his former boss. Inside was a check for $250,000 and a note written in careful handwriting. "Ms. Greger," it read, "I owe you an apology. When Garrett came to work for my company 8 years ago, he listed references that I never properly checked. One of them was fabricated. Had I done my due diligence, I would have discovered he'd been fired from his previous position for similar behavior, getting a colleague pregnant and harassing her until she left the company. I hired a man who had a documented history of this cruelty, and he went on to hurt you and others. I cannot undo that harm, but I can ensure it doesn't happen again. This check is not meant to absolve anyone's guilt. It's meant to set up a trust fund for Isla's education. Every child deserves a future, regardless of who their father is. I've also established a grant through my company for single mothers pursuing careers in architecture. It's called the Greger Fellowship, if you'll permit the name. Perhaps some good can come from this, after all. With deepest respect, Frederick Callahan." I sat in my office, reading that letter 3 times, trying to process what it meant. This man, who had no obligation to me, who'd simply hired the wrong person, felt responsible enough to try to make amends for someone else's sins. The money went into a trust for Isla, exactly as Frederick intended. But the fellowship, that became something bigger. It became my way of transforming pain into purpose. Every year, we award grants to 5 single mothers who are trying to build careers in architecture or design while raising children alone. We provide mentorship, childcare stipends, and professional development. We create the support system I wish I'd had. And Garrett? He exists somewhere in Salt Lake City, I suppose. I don't track him. I don't think about him. He's become irrelevant, which is perhaps the greatest revenge of all. The man who once consumed my thoughts, who represented my greatest pain, is now just a biological footnote in Isla's medical history. Last month, Isla asked me about her father for the first time. We were driving home from her gymnastics class, and out of nowhere, she said, "Maya's dad came to watch her today. How come I don't have a dad?" I'd prepared for this question for years, but it still hit me like a physical blow. I pulled over into a parking lot, turned to look at my daughter, and told her the truth in age-appropriate terms. "You have a biological father, sweetheart, but he made a choice not to be part of our family. That wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was about him not being ready to be the kind of parent every child deserves. And that's sad for him, because he's missing out on knowing the most amazing person I've ever met." She processed this with the seriousness of someone far older than 6. Then she said, "That's okay, Mama. We have each other, and that's a pretty good family." Out of the mouths of babes. So that's my story. The story of how the man who broke me ended up broken by his own actions. How abandonment led to achievement. How pain transformed into purpose. People expect revenge stories to end with dramatic confrontations, with the wronged party standing over the defeated villain delivering cutting remarks. But real revenge is quieter than that. It's building a life so full and beautiful that the person who tried to destroy you becomes irrelevant. It's protecting your child from toxicity, disguised as redemption. It's knowing that while someone else is still trying to outrun their guilt, you've already crossed the finish line. Garrett Holbrook tried to trap me with his cruelty. Instead, he freed me to become someone I never would have been if he'd stayed. The successful architect, the fierce mother, the woman who turned rejection into resilience. And Isla? She's growing up knowing that family isn't defined by who shows up at conception, but by who shows up for all the moments that follow. For the scraped knees and the school plays and the middle-of-the-night fevers. For the ordinary, beautiful moments that make up a life. Garrett wanted back in because he finally realized what he'd lost. But here's what he'll never understand. He didn't lose us. He was never part of us to begin with. You can't lose something you never fought for, never sacrificed for, never showed up for. So when people ask me if I ever got my revenge on the man who left me pregnant and alone, I smile and think about my thriving business, my incredible daughter, and the fellowship helping other mothers rise from similar ashes. Then I say, I didn't need to. He's living with himself, and that's punishment enough. That's the real twist. The greatest revenge wasn't something I did to him. It was everything I became without him. And if you're going through something similar, if you're standing where I stood 7 years ago, terrified and abandoned and wondering if you'll survive this, I want you to know something. You will. Not only will you survive, you'll evolve into someone stronger than you can imagine right now. The person who abandoned you will become a footnote while you become the whole story. Take it from someone who lived it. That's my story. Thanks for listening.
And if you love real-life stories with tough choices, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.